She never thought a single moment could cost her so much. Camilla had lived a long life before she ever set foot inside Buckingham Palace as more than a guest. She had grown up in the English countryside, the daughter of a wine merchant, surrounded by horses, gardens, and the kind of quiet comfort that the British upper class wore like a second skin. She was never royal. She never trained to be royal. She simply fell in love with a man who happened to be the heir to the British throne, and that love, patient and stubborn across 4 difficult decades, eventually brought her to one of the most watched stages in the world. By the time she became queen, Camilla was in her 70s. She had already endured more public scrutiny than most people could imagine surviving. The British press had spent years treating her as a villain. Ordinary people had blamed her for things that were far more complicated than any newspaper headline could explain. And through all of it, she had kept going. She had smiled at the cameras. She had shaken the right hands. She had attended the right ceremonies. She had learned the unwritten rules of palace life with the quiet determination of someone who understood that survival in this world required patience above everything else. But there was one set of rules she had not fully understood. Not yet. The Royal Guard was not like other soldiers. The men and women who stood at the gates and corridors of the royal residences were drawn from some of the most respected regiments in the British Army, the Grenadier Guards, the Coldstream Guards, the Scots Guards, the Irish Guards, and the Welsh Guards. They were trained to an extraordinary standard. Their physical conditioning was severe. Their discipline was absolute. And when they stood on duty in their ceremonial positions, tall, unmoving, rifles at their sides and bearskin caps on their heads, they were bound by a code that was centuries old. That code said, do not move. Do not speak. Do not react. No matter what happens around you, no matter who speaks to you or tries to provoke you, you stand still. You are not a person in those moments. You are an institution. You are the face of the monarchy itself, pressed into human form, and your stillness is your service. Tourists tested this every single day. They stood beside the guards and pulled faces. They waved hands in front of their eyes. They shouted. They laughed. Occasionally, someone would step too close and receive a sharp verbal warning, because the guards were permitted to speak under specific circumstances, especially when their personal safety or the safety of the post was at risk. But even then, the response was measured, controlled, and immediate. It was never emotional. It was never personal. The guards were, in the truest sense, professionals. It was on a gray Tuesday morning in late autumn that the incident took place. The exact details, as with many things inside palace walls, were never confirmed officially. But enough people were present, staff members, a small team of aides, at least one photographer positioned for a scheduled engagement, that the story found its way out, piece by piece, the way most palace stories eventually do. Camilla was moving through one of the internal corridors of a royal residence. She was running late for an engagement, which was unusual for her. She was generally considered punctual, even meticulous about her schedule. But that morning, something had gone wrong with the arrangements. A car had arrived at the wrong entrance. A briefing document had been misplaced. Small things, separately harmless, had stacked on top of each other in the way that small things sometimes do, and by the time Camilla was walking down that corridor, she was already carrying the weight of a morning that had refused to cooperate. The guard was standing at his post at the end of the corridor. He was tall and very young, barely into his 20s, by the account of those who saw him. He stood perfectly straight, his eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance, his expression completely neutral. He had been standing in that position for nearly 2 hours. He would stand for 2 more before his relief arrived. Camilla approached with her aides behind her. The corridor was narrow enough that there was barely room for 2 people to pass comfortably side by side. The guard was positioned close to the wall, as protocol required, leaving the center of the passage clear. But in that particular moment, for reasons that were later described as a combination of the narrow space, Camilla's brisk pace, and possibly a slight misjudgment of the distance between them, her arm made contact with the guard's shoulder as she passed. It was not a gentle brush. Those who were present said it was firm enough to be noticeable. Whether it was deliberate or accidental, or somewhere in the complicated territory between the two, was never established with complete certainty. What was established, clearly and immediately, was the guard's response. He did not move. He did not speak. He did not blink. He did not look at her. He remained exactly as he had been, upright, still, his gaze fixed ahead, as though nothing had happened at all. As though the Queen of England had not just made physical contact with his shoulder in a narrow palace corridor on a grey Tuesday morning. The aides behind Camilla stopped. One of them later described the moment as feeling like the air in the corridor had changed temperature. Camilla herself paused. She turned slightly and looked at the guard. He did not look back at her. He simply stood there, immovable and silent, doing exactly what centuries of tradition had trained him to do. She said something to him, quietly, not loudly. The exact words were not captured by anyone close enough to be certain. One aide recalled it as something between an apology and a question. Another remembered it as shorter than that, just a few words, almost murmured. The guard did not respond. His orders did not allow for it. Camilla stood there for a moment longer than felt comfortable. Then she continued down the corridor and out of the building. The engagement she attended that morning went smoothly, by all public accounts. She smiled. She spoke. She performed the role with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for years. But those who were with her that day said she was quieter than usual on the drive back. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked out the window, and she did not say very much to anyone. The story did not break immediately. These things rarely do from inside the palace. The institution has always been extraordinarily good at managing information, not through deception, exactly, but through a culture of discretion so deeply ingrained that people who work there learn almost by instinct which things are spoken about and which things are not. For a few days, the incident existed only in the memories of those who had been present. Then it leaked. It began with a single item in a mid-tier tabloid, brief, vaguely sourced, framed as a question more than a statement. But it was enough. By the following morning, the story had been picked up by 3 more outlets. By the afternoon, it was being discussed on radio programs and social media simultaneously. By the next day, every major newspaper in Britain had some version of it on their website, and journalists were filing requests with Palace Communications for comment. The palace said nothing. This was not unusual. The palace almost never commented on internal matters, and a policy of silence on such things was not itself an admission of anything. But silence, in the age of rolling news and social media, does not function the way it once did. Silence gets interpreted. Silence gets filled with speculation. And the speculation, in this case, was not kind. The coverage split broadly into 2 camps, which reflected the 2 broad views of Camilla that had existed in British public life for as long as she had been prominent. Those who had warmed to her over the years, and there were genuinely many of them, people who had watched her serve quietly and competently through years of difficult transition, tended to describe the incident as an accident, or at worst a moment of human frustration in a role that demands impossible levels of composure every single day. They argued that Camilla was not trained from birth for this, that she had stepped into the monarchy later in life than anyone else who had held her position, and that extending her some grace was both fair and proportionate. Those who had never fully accepted her took a different view. For them, the incident confirmed something they had always suspected, that beneath the careful public presentation, there was a temperament that did not entirely belong on the throne. They pointed to the guard's professionalism and contrasted it unfavorably with the behavior of the person he was there to serve. The young soldier, they argued, had shown more dignity in that corridor than the Queen herself. The commentary went on for days. Columnists wrote long pieces about the nature of royal protocol and what it demanded from those at the top of the institution as much as those at the bottom. Historians were interviewed about precedents, past instances of royal figures falling out with staff, breaking ceremonial codes, behaving in ways that the palace subsequently had to quietly manage. Constitutional commentators pointed out that the monarchy's public standing had always depended not on law but on perception, and that perception, once damaged, was extraordinarily difficult to repair. Inside the palace, things moved differently. There were no press conferences. There were no formal reprimands made public. But those who understood how the institution worked could read the signals clearly enough. Camilla's schedule was adjusted slightly in the days that followed. Her public appearances were handled with noticeably more logistical care than usual. The small chaos of that Tuesday morning, the wrong entrance, the missing document, the tight corridor, was not going to be allowed to repeat itself. And at some point, in a room that no one outside the palace would ever be able to describe, someone spoke to Camilla about what had happened. Not harshly, almost certainly. The palace does not operate through harshness. It operates through implication, through carefully chosen language, through conversations that say one thing on the surface and mean something else entirely underneath. But the message would have been clear to anyone who received it: this cannot happen again. What that conversation was like for Camilla is something only she could know. She had spent 40 years navigating other people's opinions of her. She had sat through public protests and hostile headlines and the cold silences of people who would never forgive her for existing in the role she occupied. She had learned, through simple necessity, to absorb those things and continue. In that sense, she was perhaps better equipped than most to receive a quiet correction without collapsing under it. But this was different. This was not the public or the press. This was the institution itself, speaking to her in its own language, reminding her of something she already knew intellectually but had not, until that gray Tuesday morning, understood in her body. The monarchy's authority did not come from the people who wore its crowns. It came from something much older and much less personal than that. It came from the accumulated weight of centuries of tradition, upheld by people whose names no one remembered, soldiers who stood still for hours in freezing courtyards, footmen who moved through the same halls their great-grandfathers had moved through, protocol officers who spent their careers ensuring that the machine ran smoothly enough that no one on the outside ever had cause to notice it at all. These people did not serve the individuals who sat on the throne. They served the idea of the throne. And that idea was larger, and more durable, and in many ways more powerful than any single person who had ever occupied it. The guard who had stood motionless in that corridor was not a young man doing a job. He was, in that moment, the living expression of everything the monarchy claimed to be. His stillness was not just training. It was a statement. It said, this institution is not moved by the tempers of individuals. It is not shaken by one difficult morning or one unguarded moment. It endures. Camilla's subsequent public appearances carried a quality that observers noted but found difficult to name precisely. She had always been composed in public, always professional and warm and reliably capable of reading a room. But there was something in the weeks after the incident that went slightly beyond that. A greater stillness, perhaps. A quality of attention that had not quite been there before. She seemed more aware of the space she occupied, more careful in the way she moved through it. Whether this was a conscious change or simply the natural consequence of a woman processing something that had surprised her, it is impossible to say. People who knew her well said she did not speak about the incident. She did not reference it in private conversations any more than the palace had referenced it in public ones. She simply continued, the way she had always continued, placing one foot in front of the other and doing the work. That, in its own way, was the most royal thing about her. The guard was never identified publicly. He returned to his post after that morning and continued his service with the same anonymous dedication that the role required. He received no recognition for what he had done, because what he had done was simply what was expected of him. He had stood still. He had not reacted. He had upheld the code. In the world he worked in, that was not remarkable. It was the minimum. But there is something worth sitting with in the image of that moment, a powerful woman, one of the most recognized people on the planet, standing in a corridor looking at a young soldier who would not look back at her, who would not speak to her, who would not acknowledge that the moment had happened at all. And the Queen, for just a few seconds, not knowing what to do. The monarchy has survived for 1,000 years. It has survived wars and revolutions and the collapse of empires. It has survived scandal and tragedy and the relentless pressure of a modern world that grows more skeptical of inherited power with every passing generation. It survives, when it survives, because of moments exactly like the one in that corridor, moments when the institution holds its shape even when the people inside it briefly lose theirs. The guard held his shape. And in doing so, without a word, without a gesture, without even the flicker of an expression, he reminded everyone present of something that all the ceremony and tradition and centuries of protocol had always been trying to say. The crown is not just something you wear. It is something you must become. And becoming it, truly becoming it, takes longer than most people imagine, and costs more than anyone tells you at the beginning. Camilla, stepping back out into the pale autumn light that morning, carrying the weight of a moment she had not planned and could not undo, understood this in a way she had not understood it before. Some lessons come gently. Others arrive in a narrow corridor, in silence, from a young man who never even turns to look at you. Those are the ones you do not forget.